agenda to make life easier.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of our 3rd annual Spread Respect Forum. My name is Sierra Whitlock, and I'm an assistant director at the League and have the privilege of working closely with our Spread Respect initiative. Before we get started, I've got a couple of thank yous, so bear with me here for a minute. First and foremost, thank you to all of our speakers and moderators for their willingness to be involved and their time. A huge thank you to my partner in putting on the forum, Kate Bergstrom. Without her, there would be no forum, and it's been an absolute privilege to work together to make this event happen. Next, Brad Walker, our commissioner, who's jumped in with 2 feet from day 1 and has played an active role in the work we do through our Spread Respect initiative. To the America East staff, thank you for your contributions, your willingness to run tests, and overall keeping us sane through the last couple of weeks. Lastly, and most importantly, thank you to all of you for being here today to highlight Black leaders in sport. Yesterday's focus was breaking down barriers by understanding identity and intersectionality. If you missed the sessions, you can watch the recordings here on the Whova platform or on our YouTube channel. As Kate mentioned yesterday, this is our first year using Whova, so I'll quickly run through some of the logistical items with you. So Whova will serve as your command central, if you will. You'll navigate between sessions, polls, question and answers. Any sort of engagement that you'll do will happen through Whova. Hopefully you've joined this session via Zoom, and that will allow you to see the panelists in gallery view. If not a huge deal, but I would recommend for the next session that you join via Zoom. As you can see here, you'll be able to engage on the right here, the Q&A, polls, you'll have access to the community board, all that good stuff will be on the right. And then when you join through Zoom, I would just recommend that you split screens. That way you'll have access to all of the engagement pieces and then be able to see everyone all at once. At 11 o'clock today, 11 to 11:30, we'll have a networking session. It'll run in sort of a speed networking session style. So you'll be at a table of 3 people, and then every 10 minutes, those tables will shuffle. So you'll have an opportunity to engage with multiple people. To incentivize some participation today, we have 3 $50 Uber Eats gift cards for our top 3 participants of the forum. You'll be able to track on those through the community leaderboard. So any engagement that you do throughout the platform will earn you points, and throughout the platform, it'll sort of show you areas where you can earn points. So keep an eye out for those. One attendee from each networking session will win a $25 Uber Eats gift card that will be selected at random. Another random attendee from the entire forum will be selected. You do have to attend 3 sessions to be eligible for those, so do keep that in mind. Those will be selected, drawn later this afternoon, and I'll send those out via email. As far as the schedule today, once I wrap up here, then I will turn it over to Karen and Samuel, and they will give us the fostering environments of belonging and owning difficult conversations. After that, then we'll go into our networking session that I mentioned before. Next will be the business of college athletics, changing the face of leadership, which is a panel with 4 recently hired Black commissioners, which we're really excited about. And lastly, we'll wrap up with working in sport, aligning passions with paths. And we will talk with 3 sport industry professionals who have sort of unique career paths, and they'll talk to us a little bit how they got to where they are today. At the conclusion of today's forum, you'll receive an email from me with the survey link. It's super quick, should only take you 2 or 3 minutes. We would really appreciate if you would take the time to take the survey. We use that feedback for years to come to continue to improve this event. Quick plug here, if you'd like to join the conversation on social, you can do so by using the hashtag #SpreadRespect. We'd love to hear from you, anything you've learned, how you're feeling about things, pictures, whatever it might be, we'd love to see it. So next we'll transition into today's forum. Change doesn't happen overnight. One of our speakers from yesterday, Deja Young, a 3-time Paralympic medalist, said it takes a spark to start a fire. I encourage all of you to let today be the spark. Today, I'm excited to listen, learn, and become a better champion of change. I hope that we all continue to learn and create more inclusive environments. Our first session will be fostering environments of belonging and owning difficult conversations. It is my pleasure to introduce Karen and Samuel. Dr. Karen A. Clinton-Jones has served nearly 30 years as a change agent, diversity practitioner. She currently serves as Binghamton University's inaugural Vice President, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. In this role, Jones leads and coordinates the university's strategic approach to diversity in all aspects of workforce development, campus life, focusing specifically on education and employment, equity, affirmative action, cultural understanding, cultural competency, community outreach, and civil and human rights. Prior to joining the Binghamton community, Jones served as Chief Diversity Officer and the Title IX Coordinator for Buffalo State College. Jones holds a PhD in Educational Leadership and Policy with a concentration in higher education. She earned a master's in counselor education from SUNY College at Brockport and a bachelor's in criminal justice from Buffalo State. Samuel Caldwell is the Chief Diversity Officer and Associate Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at the University at Albany, where he works in collaboration with campus partners to further a culture that values diversity and embraces equity and inclusion. Samuel has deep experience as a corporate professional in project management, problem solving, issue resolution, lobbying, and risk mitigation. Samuel served honorably in the United States Coast Guard Reserves, most recently at the rank of lieutenant. He's a life member of Phi Beta Sigma. Samuel holds a bachelor's in business administration from Rutgers University, an MBA from Strayer University, and earned certificates in diversity and inclusion from Cornell University and the University of South Florida. Karen and Samuel, thanks for being here. I'll turn it to you.
Thank you so very much. We absolutely appreciate the stage setting for today, Sierra, and also the very kind introduction. We're going to transition right into the content that we're going to be sharing today. And I'm looking forward to a great conversation. And while I don't make it a habit of speaking for my colleagues, I know that Dr. Jones is looking forward to today's conversation as well. So I'll hand it off to my colleague, Dr. Jones, to begin this conversation. And to the extent that you do have questions, we'd ask that you make use of the chat function to do so, or the Q&A function to do so. And we'll do the very best we can to make this dialogue as engaging and collaborative as it can be, even in this virtual space. Thanks again for the introduction, and thanks for having us today. Dr. Jones?
Thank you, Samuel. Good morning, everyone, and we're glad to be here. And even more importantly, glad that you are here to join us. And so we wanted to start this conversation with the premise of how is it that we arrive at an inclusive excellence conversation, but more importantly, wanted to give you the backdrop as to how it is that we arrive at an inclusive excellence model. And so in 2005, the American Association of Colleges and Universities came up with this definition of talking about how do we make certain that our institutions across the country, and even more importantly, globally, are creating strategies that arrive at how do we achieve institutional excellence. And so they came up with the framework of creating an inclusive excellence model for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we added belonging, particularly for this purpose. And so what does that really mean? And so for today's purpose in establishing the groundwork and the framework for today's conversation, it means simply that we have a welcoming and inclusive campus community, that we respect one another, and that we're willing to engage with others who have a differing perspective, differing opinions, and that we're able to mutually come to a decision that we may not agree, but we can respect one another and engaging in those conversations. And lastly, that our community is at its best when we encourage and support the inclusion and create a sense of belonging for everyone, for students, faculty, and staff. And most importantly, and when we model that behavior, will we demonstrate that we're an inclusive campus community where everyone has a sense of belonging. And so again, we also shared with you an article from the Harvard Business Review. And so what was interesting about this conversation is that the Harvard Business Review, and everyone loves to have data, and there's research that supports the work that we do. And so in 2019, the Harvard Business Review conducted this research, and they invited 2,000 participants. And what's also interesting is that this was prior to COVID. And so when you think about what's happened after COVID and what was taking place prior to COVID, one of the things that they looked at is what are the elements of belonging? And so if you also think about Maslow's hierarchy of need, there's this sense of belonging, this craving that we all have that aligns to that we all matter, that we all have this sense of belonging to others. It's really a human need. And so according to the article, it talks about mattering, about fitting in, about feeling socially connected to one another. And when I worked in corporate, we had this sense of, there was this book called Having Refrigerator Rights, right? And so it's being able to walk into someone's home, and you're able to walk into their home and just essentially open the refrigerator without asking for permission. And so that in and of itself creates a sense of belonging, being accepted, feeling included and recognized. And so the survey essentially surveyed 2,000 people to ask what it meant to feel belonging. And so of that survey, 40% talked about what it meant to feel isolated, right? And so there was a sense of a lower organizational commitment, meaning that they were disengaged from their company. But it also spoke to this great sense of resignation that they weren't aligned with the company's value. And it also spoke to a larger sense of absences, because when folks are not feeling engaged or having a sense of belonging with the organization, what happens? We feel sick. And sometimes we don't want to show up to work. And so we have the sense of taking mental health breaks, or we have other symptomatics that show up in our physical being. And so we take out or we call out because we're not feeling engaged in the organization. It manifests itself in other aspects of our lives. And so we see a heightened sense of absences in the person's workflow. And then the last thing that they also point out is that they're less likely to make a meaningful contribution to the organization because they don't feel as if their voice is being heard. And then they also point out in the article, which we've also shared with you, is that what are some of the benefits of belonging, and how many of us sitting on the call can speak to what it means to us when we have this sense of engagement with our respective organization, right? We're more likely to be engaged with the organization, which means that there's more likely that there's going to be a higher increase of retention, that folks are going to stay for the long haul. And how many of us can look at our respective organizations to say, there are folks who've been here 30 and 40 years. We're also more likely to refer our friends as applicants. And at least I can say that when I worked in corporate America, there was a benefit to referring our friends. You got additional bonuses when you did that. And so the other piece to that is when you refer your friends or other family members to the organization, it creates this additional sense of adding value to your circle of friends and creating a sense of belonging. The other thing that adds to it is there's this contributing or contribution to change. You're more likely to be flexible to the organizational change because it also adds to a sense of trust. And when I'm likely to trust you, I'm more likely to be flexible to the organizational change, the organizational dynamics. I'm willing to bend with the organization because I have trust in my leadership. And also I feel that my voice is being heard, that I'm making a valuable contribution. And so there's also, again, going back to the sense that I belong to the organization and that my voice is being heard, which also leads to a sense of productivity and that I'm influencing the decisions of the organization. Now, that doesn't mean that my contributions or that my point of view is always being taken, but it does make the sense that my contributions are being weighted, that they're being considered, that I'm being heard, and that some point in time that my contributions are going to contribute to the decisions that are being made. And lastly, that my attendance is going to increase. And so I'm one of these folks who enjoys every organization I've been in. And so the longevity is there. And so I'm also someone who's seldom out sick. And so again, when you think about creating this sense of belonging and how it contributes to the DE&I conversations, one of the things that we think about is how do we create this even within, not only the larger, the macro organization, but the micro organization as well, within your respective teams and the larger units within that you serve.
Thank you very much, Karen. And I love that linkage between feeling excluded and the fact that that can cause detriment or harm to the organization to some degree or other. And in contrast, feelings of belonging help to enhance and or create contributions to the organization that we're in. So as we have a little bit more of a conversation and we talk about organization and we talk about who's in the organization, I even heard Dr. Jones reference that there were some encouragement for individuals to refer people who they knew to the organization. And that leads somewhat to kind of a conversation that's usually not verbal around people like us or people like me and or people who are like them, and how we frame and define who we designate as being part of us or one of us, and who perhaps we designate as not being one of us. So we take a look at this rendering, which really works from the inside out or from that innermost circle and radiates outward from there, that really speaks to this whole notion of intersectionality. And I'm encouraged to hear that that was part of the sharing, the discussion yesterday. So let's talk a little bit more about that and then do so within the context of navigating difficult conversations. So when we show up, every aspect of our personhood shows up with us. And for those individuals who are in organizations for lengthy periods of time and those who are in organizations for lesser periods of time, you may find that there seem to be just some realities around who typically is there, who's in the workspace and who isn't. So I'll use just a personal example of kind of one of the ways that we problem solve, at least in the groups that I tend to find myself in. And one of our tried and true message of trying to problem solve, and we're talking again about having difficult conversations, is this whole notion of brainstorming. So let's say we're in a group, and myself and Dr. Jones, and I see that we're joined by 19 of our closest friends looking at the attendee roster really quickly, or 20 or so, and we're engaging in a brainstorming activity. And there are those who are wired a little bit more to be extroverted, who brainstorming is a natural exercise that they find to be, something that really helps create great ideas. There may be some individuals in the room, like myself, who are natural introverts. And as a result, the processing that we're doing isn't really going to be verbalized. It's done a little bit more internally. So even when we set up different ways that we look to go about our work or to solve problems, we still may be operating in ways where we're creating a dynamic that perhaps works more to the natural benefit of some than perhaps it works to others. So we consider personality types. When we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, that first circle that's labeled internal dimensions really speaks to what I refer to as the usual suspects when we're talking about diversity, specifically race and/or ethnicity and gender. If we're having a conversation about diversity, the expectation is that we're going to be having a conversation about race. We're going to be having a conversation about gender or something else. When there are other dimensions that may be just as salient to the individuals who are participating in that exercise. So I'll ask a question if I may. As I'm scanning the attendee roster and I see that we're joined by our colleague Brenna and our colleague Kara and our colleague Maddie and our colleague Melissa and Peg and Sean and Sierra and Stephanie and some others, if you were presented with the question and you were asked to complete the sentence or the thought, I am, and you were presented with 5 different elements of your identity to complete that I am thought with, what might be some of the things that you would identify as ways that you view yourself? So I'll make it personal. I am a Black, heterosexual, cisgendered, Christian male. Those are points of my identity. For someone else, their faith center may be part of how they identify. It may not. Whether they have a subscribed faith center may be part of their identity or not. Their habits, their hobbies, their income level, where they feel they're situated on the socioeconomic ladder, their job title, all of those different things may be some things that come into mind. Level of educational attainment, certainly. When we speak to who am I am this. I identify as these things. As we consider the work that we do, particularly across the conference, there are affiliations that we may have that may put us in a position to be a bit more effective, successful, impactful than others. And when we think about having difficult conversations, one thing that I owe it to my colleagues to do is, and let's say, if we go back to the attendee roster, let's say I'm having a conversation with Jonathan, I'm having a conversation with Leslie, I'm having a conversation with Thomas. One thing I owe them is to recognize that when they show up, all of the identities that are meaningful to them show up with them. And as a result, when we're trying to identify best ways to have difficult conversations, which we're going to transition into on the next slide, it's very important to identify that the individual who shows up, in terms of what I see, there may be so much more to them than what I see. So I think the question is not, do you see me? But perhaps the question is, do you really see me? Or are you willing to really see me? So we have a model here. And before Dr. Jones transitions us through kind of how to make this model come to life, we see on the right side of this slide that there are a few different things going on. We have the need to have a crucial conversation or a candid conversation or a courageous conversation. So that's the need, and that's kind of at the epicenter of what needs to occur. And we have these dynamics that are existing in the same space as the need to have the conversation. We have opinions that may be opposing. They may not be opposing. They may simply be different. We may have emotions around the subject matter or even the individual that we're engaging in that conversation with or need to engage in that conversation with. And then we have the perception of stakes. How significant is this issue? How significant is this challenge or this unique opportunity we have to begin to do the work to transition from what it is we say we wish to be to actually doing the work that's necessary to evolve into what it is that we say we wish to be. Dr. Jones?
Thank you, Sam. And so one of the things that I think is important, and this comes with some level, many of us struggle with how do you have a difficult conversation? And the way in which I manage it is the use of grace. And as Sam says, you know, these are crucial conversations, and we use these terms because it's nationally recognized as well. And so you do have the opposing opinions, you have the strong emotions, because sometimes people are like, I feel this kind of way. And so you'll oftentimes get that comment, I feel, right? And so my immediate reaction is to, let's take the emotion out of it. How do we take the emotion out of it? By removing I feel. Let's not use that word, but also recognize that these are high stake conversations, and that sometimes careers are at stakes, you know, relationships are at stakes, and then organizational challenges can occur. And so one of the things that I have used in the work that I've done, and that best practices with coaches, professional coaches, I'm not to suggest that you all are professional coaches, but I mean organizational coaches who are, you know, guiding people through how to have difficult conversations, will oftentimes say, remove the emotion and talk about what it is that you're trying to achieve. And so some of their guidelines are, don't wait for the behavior to continuously be repeated, because then what happens is that you're oftentimes allowing bad behavior to become a socially accepted norm throughout the organization. And, you know, one of the things that I oftentimes talk with my colleagues about is, you cannot change the organizational culture by rewarding bad behavior, because then it becomes acceptable, right? And the other thing that follows with that is, we need to change our mindset by saying, you know, I don't want to hurt this person's feelings, or I don't want to ruin our friendship. And part of that comes because, you know, we all build relationships with folks in the organizations, and then it becomes one of, this is my friend, as opposed to, I need to do this in order to achieve the results that I need to achieve for the sake of the organization. And my perspective is, how do I achieve the same results by using grace and positioning what I'm trying to achieve in a way that I would like to receive, that's also palatable. And so, for example, one of the things that I've had to do, which is, it's never easy, is helping someone to think about moving on from the organization. And, you know, part of the conversation is, how do we establish performance measures that clearly delineate for someone what the objectives are for their respective role, that meets the mission of the organization. And so my position has always been, if we work towards the mission of the organization, then we don't have to focus on what I'm doing. It's not about Karen, it's what's in the best interest of the organization. And so we establish performance objectives that meets the needs of the mission, but also rewarding the person so that they can achieve professional objectives as well. But when that's not happening, it's time to have the difficult conversation as to, what can I do to support you and your professional growth, and whether or not this is the role that's going to help you to achieve that. And so again, going back to, how do you practice having a difficult conversation? And so I have great friends who are like, Karen, you know, let's work on some talking points to help you achieve the goals, so that you may think about, how do you make this a little bit more palatable, so that the point is getting across, and that you're still allowing the person to be whole, and you're not removing who they are as a person, but you're working on the objective of talking and point the performance measures, right? And then also, how do you manage your emotions? Because it's not easy talking to someone about, you missed that measure, you missed that mark. But it's like, things did not go as well as we would have expected. Or let's talk about what your hopes were, or what were you expecting, and did you achieve the goals that you were working towards? So let's start from that, and then talk about how it is that we can meet those measures the next time. Because then you're allowing that person to talk about their expectations, and then how it is that you can help them to achieve those goals. And also being empathic. How do you talk about supporting someone in a way that's not emotional, right? And it's like, I feel, and it's like, no, let's talk about how can you demonstrate compassion and support without being emotional. Oh, I feel sad, I feel happy. These things are not supportive in a way that's meaningful, because it just gets in a way and it gets messy. And so if you talk about, I truly understand where you're coming from, I support you, or if there's anything I can do to support you on this journey, let me know. Here's some additional support measures, or here's how I would like to support you with your professional career. Here's some additional outcomes that I think we can work towards. These are things that I think, or at least that I have found helpful when I did not meet my expectation, or there have been even instances where I've had to tell the president, listen, I did not meet your expectation, and here's how I'm going to do better the next time. And we have to own it. And that goes back to, how do you look for a solution when you know that there are opportunities to do better? And so come prepared to offer those solutions, professional development, a career coach, conference that someone can attend, providing them with networking opportunities when you know that someone does something in a manner that can add value to the work that they're going to do, in a way that, again, restores them rather than diminishes who they are as a person. And I will say with some, humility, that also comes with professional maturity, because there are mistakes. And so there were times in my professional career where it was like, okay, I don't want to have this conversation right now, because my emotions are not at a level where this is going to be easy to hear. So let me dial it back about 1,000. Let me sleep on this, because right now, like my mom says, I'm hotter than fish grease. And I don't know that I'm in a place where someone can actually hear what I have to say, because what I have to say is not good. And so even if you can, when it goes back to manage your own emotions as well, finding yourself in a place where you can manage. And that also speaks to sending email communications that are not in the best place where you can be, particularly responding to emails where someone has made a mistake, or someone is asking you for something and you're not in a position to respond appropriately.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. I think it might be helpful to get a sense of kind of where the audience is a little bit. So to the extent that we have the ability to leverage the chat to get some of that, we talk about having difficult conversations, and we're not going to ask anyone if you have a difficult conversation in front of you. We're going to presume that all of us probably are in a position where occasionally we're going to need to navigate that space. I guess the question would be, if you could offer it in perhaps a word or 2 words, what are the things that you found to be particularly helpful with helping to navigate challenging conversations? Alternatively, if there were things that you found that really short-circuited the ability to have a really necessary but crucial conversation. Would you share that in the chat or in the Q&A? And Sierra, I'll ask you for guidance on how to navigate the logistics of that. But I'd very much like to hear what types of things perhaps we've already found success with as a community, and or what types of things we know have just kind of gotten in the way, so that we can learn from one another a bit. Is that something that you can help us with, Sarah, please? Or Kate?
Yes, the chat is open both in HOVA and on Zoom. So all of our attendees can feel free to utilize those too. And Karen and Samuel, you should be able to see what comes in through the
Okay.
chat.
All right, so we'll keep our eyes open, and I do see something popping in, which is an encouragement to use the chat in HOVA or here. And I'll just ask for everyone to just kind of give us some sense of what's been helpful for you or what's kind of gotten in the way. We're not asking you to mention dates or names or who the other party was. That isn't really germane, but we really would like to get a sense of what types of things have been helpful, what types of things haven't been helpful in terms of navigating challenging conversations. And we'll just give the audience a moment to just process the question. And as things come to mind, please feel free to post them in the chat. All right, I see something from our colleague Kathy. I really appreciate what Karen said. When I feel emotional about an issue, I try to wait a minute. And that may be a literal minute, that may be a figurative minute, but I give it some time to really think through what the points I want to share by way of a difficult conversation. Kathy, thank you very much for sharing that. What other thoughts? Yeah, I'm sorry.
I was also going to add, it also helps me when I have folks outside of the arena who work in different fields, who can add additional perspective to give me that grounding perspective. And so if you don't have that, I would offer that as well.
Thank you. From HOVA, we have some feedback to remove emotions, do not make it personal.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll ask, there's just a follow-up question to that. How do you navigate not making it personal when for one or both of the parties in the conversation, it feels personal, or they're making it personal and you're aware that for them it may be personal? How can we kind of help keep the focus on the issue and kind of strip that away from it? And we heard some of the things that were offered by Dr. Jones in terms of how we can have that dialogue. When the rubber meets the road, the conversation needs to be had, and it's going to be interesting or challenging or difficult. What types of things help to navigate that? And I realize the chat is a little quiet, but I can tell from the names on this attendee roster, we're not dealing with a bunch of bashful individuals. So I don't want you to focus on whether the answer is perfect. We're just looking for something that's helped you, because if it's helped you, it's likely to help someone else too. And I have some difficult conversations I need to navigate in the not too distant future. So anything you can offer that's benefited you may certainly be a benefit to me and perhaps others as well. What other thoughts are there out there? We have anything coming in through HOVA, Sierra or Kate?
Not yet, but
Okay.
let's go attendees here. Use the chat.
Yeah, and if we're not there yet, we'll just transition to some of the things or reinforce some of the things that have come up. Recognizing common goals is always a good place to start. One individual doesn't have to win to the detriment of someone else. Thank you very much, Peg. A neutral environment is helpful. Sometimes meeting in a conference room instead of, Peg is kind enough to say, instead of the office. So not having someone come onto my turf or having the conversation occur on their turf may be very, very helpful. Peg, thank you very much for sharing that. Recognizing that how we treat others very often is very similar to the way that we want to be treated. I see something that's coming from, I'm guessing that's L. Savage, and it reads, use examples that focus on work-related challenges. I think that's very good counsel. And I'm curious as to whether or not when it feels personal to us, how able we are for it not to be translated as if it's personal. So that whole notion around that first bullet, which really reinforces some of the things we're hearing here, using respectful words and action. Kathy, I don't think I disagree. That indeed is the $1 million question. How do we do that? So we know that there's something that needs to be navigated. We want to win. So with the America East, we take very great pride in our performance. We want to be successful. And in wanting to be successful, one of the questions is it possible for me to be successful and someone who I need to have a challenging conversation with to be successful as well? Thank you. Thank you, Z. Take the other person's perspective into consideration. Be open-minded. I'm not reading that statement, and Z, I'm not going to speak for you. I'm thanking you for the input, and I'm wondering whether or not our ability to take someone else's perspective into consideration means in any way that we have to move off of the position that we hold. I don't believe the answer to that question to be yes. The question is, how can we allow both of those perspectives to exist in the same space at the same time and still move towards getting to resolution? So I'm going to ask the question a little bit differently. The last time, or a different question altogether, the last time that you were in a position where you needed to have a difficult conversation, it needed to happen, and you had to undertake that difficult conversation. What outcome came about as a result of having the conversation? Not asking, did it end up great or did it end up not so great? The question is, as you went through the process, what was one of the outcomes that you experienced that perhaps you did not go into the conversation even looking for? And I'm happy to go first. In having a conversation that was challenging with someone that I needed to have a conversation with, one of the unintended outcomes was the recognition that I was going into the conversation with some predispositions around what I thought was going on. I didn't realize that I was bringing some stuff, to use a non-scientific term, into that conversation, that having the conversation helped me to be dispelled of. So, and what that was is, I wasn't only focused on the actions, I was bringing into the conversation some attribution, some of what I thought was driving the actions, which really was grounded in nothing other than my opinion. So for anyone else who's been in that space, thank you from Hoover. I realized that the way I was thinking about the situation was largely from assumptions or my own bias or biases about how the other party would react. Thank you, Hoover, for articulating that much better than I was able to. We have these implicit biases, and I'm sure we've heard the term before, perhaps not, where there are things going on for us that are operating outside of our conscious thoughts. And we're bringing that stuff into conversations, we're bringing that stuff into interactions, and sometimes it really can serve to get in the way. Thank you very much, whoever posted that into Hoover. And as we transition into the latter part of our conversation. If there are other questions or other thoughts that have arisen, please feel free to make use of the chat to share those. And as we do that, thank you, Kara. I approach difficult conversations by listening first. Kara, thank you for that. Because when we recognize we need to have a difficult conversation, I think our inherent reflex is to think about what it is that we want to communicate, not necessarily how critical it is for us to listen. So thank you, Kara, for that reminder. By listening first, it helps me to dispel some of those preconceived ideas, some of those implicit biases or that stuff that I might have had going into the conversation. That's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Yes,
Yeah.
Dr. Jones?
Yeah, I appreciate, as you raised that question, I was just having a colleague or conversation with a colleague on Friday because I asked the question of, and I'm very much cognizant as to how my physicality shows up in a room well before I speak. And so I asked him the question of how am I perceived, and he was like, Karen, you're great. You're a great colleague. I was like, but sometimes I realize that when I open my mouth, I can be very direct, and I'm learning to be quiet more, as Kara says, and just listening more and then posing a question as opposed to making a statement. And so, Kara, I appreciated that because I'm learning to do that more in a way of eliciting feedback as opposed to making statements. And so we're all learning. And one of the things that Sam and I and Sierra and Kate and Marcia talked about last week is that, we're all learning and growing, and our role is we're just planting seeds, right? And allowing the harvest to grow. And we don't know when the manifestation of this work is going to fully bloom, but for right now, we're just planting seeds. And when we think about the characteristics of an inclusive and respectful work environment, part of this conversation is now, and that it's important for us to think about, using respectful words and modeling behavior that others can see. And so much like Sam, I identify as a strong Christian. And so I tell folks that it's important for me to live a life that's pleasing for others, or at least pleasing to God, so that others can be drawn to him. And so I think about that daily. And so when I say that it's important for me to use words with grace, I mean that. And so that whatever I do, that it's palatable and that folks don't respond to my behavior, but they're able to hear what I have to say. And that we're familiar with policies and best practices for inclusive work and environment, because it does us no good to check the box to say we've got 4 women, 2 of whom are Black, 1 is of the LGBTQ community, 1 is Hispanic, if we're not creating an environment where folks can actually show up to do the jobs that they've been hired to do, and to do it with joy, because who wants to come up to an environment where they hate coming to work? That's work, right? And that we recognize our common goals of recruiting diverse talent, not just because we're checking the box, but that our students deserve to see folks that look like them, because it sharpens our work. And so if you think about, the work of corporations and how it's global, and more importantly, about the benefit of working on diverse teams, and that it sharpens creativity, and that it helps us to think about things in ways that we generally wouldn't when you have homogeneity amongst a group of folks, right? And that we should treat others the way they want to be treated, as opposed to what the golden rule says, which is, oh, I want you to treat me the way, I'm gonna treat you the way I want to be treated. Well, that's not going to work, because I may have thick skin, and so stuff doesn't really bother me, whereas Sam may respond differently. He may be like, nah, we're not cut like that, right? And also recognize and correct behavior that derails civility and respect. And so we also have to understand, what does that look like, right? How do you have meaningful and spirited and passionate conversation and yet and still understand, okay, I don't agree with that, but I'm going to respect your right to have those conversations, right? And so, particularly given some of the most recent political conversations, we all have folks sitting at Thanksgiving dinner, Christmas, Hanukkah, with all political conversations, right? But those gatherings have been different because no one wants to have the heartfelt conversations, or at least I don't.
That is a wonderful segue into the last question that made its way into the chat. It's actually two questions, which is, how do I help my student athletes understand the importance of using inclusive language? The questioner goes on to ask, offer the statement, I get the sense that when there are adults in the room, we'll put that word in quotation mark, adults, because they are as well, they put their best foot forward, but the locker room talk can sometimes be in conflict with the sense of belonging I try to instill. I'll offer initially, thank you for the question. Thank you for the realness and the transparency of the question. And I think I'll take a crack at this, and I'll ask Dr. Jones to share her thoughts. I think using inclusive language begins with using inclusive language. So in other words, it's easier to ask someone to do what they see me do than to do I'll say comply or comport to what it is that we say we should do. So when I use inclusive language, it makes it easier to hold someone else accountable for doing so. And I'll try to answer that question from the perspective of a real life challenge that we've navigated, or I've had to navigate through. And this is around what happens when adults or perceived adults are in the room as contrasted to what happens when they're not. When conversations come up and we go kind of back to that rendering we saw a little bit earlier when we're talking about different forms of identity, that is grounded, and we don't have time to get into this whole notion of bias, and more specifically attribution bias. To be able to suggest that someone who is not like us can be navigated or dealt with or spoken to or treated in a way that we choose to treat them, or where they're perhaps being marginalized. So this is kind of getting into how bias presents most frequently, which is around this whole school referred to as microaggressive behavior. So most times when individuals find themselves on the other end of slights or mistreatment, it really isn't grounded in someone looking to be malicious. It's grounded more frequently in individuals who are choosing to marginalize members of the community based on perceived differences. So I'll hit the pause button there and then pass to my good colleague, Dr. Jones.
Yeah, I was going to. Thank you, Sam. My perspective is I don't have the luxury of treating anyone with disrespect. And so there are folks with whom I disagree. There are folks who I've seen be disrespectful towards others, who proclaim that they are progressive, they are speaking, they're woke, if you will. But in demonstrating their wokeness, they're marginalizing or harming folks of the same community they allege to protect. And so that performative wokeness is harmful to me because it creates additional work for folks who do, DE&I and B work. And so for me, it boils down to everyone is deserving of respect. And so if we go back to this notion of respect, everyone is deserving of respect. I don't care what their walk of life is or what they look like. We're good. And then we're not getting into the marginalization of folks. We're not getting into coining terms of allyship or these things, because it's truly, and I was just thinking about this the other day, if we do the right thing every day, because it's our godly, moral obligation to do this 24/7, everyone would be good. We wouldn't have to have these conversations about how to create an inclusive and respectful work environment, because we would already have it. And we wouldn't have to have conversations about what's a microaggression, because everyone would treat everyone with respect, because it's our godly moral obligation to do so. And if we come with it, with that perspective, we'll be good.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, very much. I see that we're at 10:57. We're due to go until 11 o'clock. So because we're there in America East, I won't say we only have 3 minutes. We have 3 whole minutes. And what we're going to do is go to the lightning round, so to speak. And the question simply is, what is your just one thing? What's the just one thing that you heard today, that you thought about today, that was sparked for you today, that you can take into the necessity of having some of these conversations that we need to have? We can call them difficult, we can call them challenging, we can call them necessary. What's the just one thing? Kathy, you are so very welcome. And we're encouraged that you found this session to be both helpful and inspiring. So I'll just ask for 1 to 2 words in the chat. I love it. Shifting perspective. Thank you. Someone else, what is your just one thing? Difficult conversations, the need to have them isn't really going to go anywhere. So what's the thing that's going to help based on what you heard today, what you might have been exposed to today, that will help that? And I love the wheel of identity is helpful. That's encouraging. To be more like Karen and Sam. Oh goodness, thank you for
I
your
say do
insight
better,
and wisdom.
do better.
Yes, thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Kara. Model brave space and centering people in the conversation. And thank you, Sierra, recognizing common goals, for sure. To the extent that you haven't had an opportunity to diversify your friend group or diversify the individuals who influenced your view of the world and your view of life, I'd encourage you to do that. If everyone who you deal with, how wokeness can be harmful. Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Thank you. So if everyone who I operate with thinks like I think, lives like I live, eats the things that I eat, deals with conflict the way that I deal with conflict, the number of tools in my resource kit is going to be somewhat limited, because I'm lacking diversity in the population that I even choose to engage in. So thank you for that. Thank you for those who shared. This is a wonderful way to start the week, reinvigorated. Joanne, thank you so very much. I appreciate that. Thomas, thank you so much. Thomas offers thanks, Karen, for your insight. It was extremely helpful. Thank you for your feedback. I see that Kate has popped up, so that's an indication that our time here is done. Kate, thanks again for the invitation, and we're handing it off to you.
Like Kate is like the dance man on
Sandman, yes.
sweeping us away.
I certainly don't want to sweep you off. I was here to help land the plane if needed, but no, Sam and Karen, thank you so much on behalf of the league office. Sarah and I have had such a joy in working with the two of you over the past couple of weeks, months on this. And from the chat, the amount of gratitude and appreciation there is for starting our Monday morning off like this is truly substantial. So thank you so much for your expertise. We really,
Of course.
we really appreciate it.
Sam, you're
You're very welcome. Thank you, Dr. Jones. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, with that, thanks again to Karen and Sam. We will shift into the next part of the forum this morning, which is our networking session. So you'll exit out of this this session here, and you'll be prompted to click into an interactive networking session. And what we'd like to do to sort of start that conversation, there'll be 10-minute rounds, 3 of them at tables of 3 and 4 individuals. You get to know each other, have some conversation amongst league members. Just sort of start that conversation. The prompt is for you to share what you think are the most important components of an inclusive environment, and or how you'd create a sense of belonging. So, taking the tangible takeaways and nuggets that Sam and Karen just shared with us and sharing them amongst each other for some true, authentic dialogue. So we will close out here and let you all jump into your networking sessions. And then just a reminder that our next session starts at 11:30, which is a panel of Black Division I commissioners, which is going to be incredibly engaging and is moderated by Diane Billings-Burford from RISE. So again, Karen, Sam, thanks so much, and everyone enjoy your networking session.
Thank you so much.